Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Tactics Board. Norwich City's Championship playoff dream may well be over, but they've still got 4 league games left this season. And first up among them, it's Portsmouth at Carrow Road tomorrow. So in this episode, I'm going to take a look at the starting 11 that Johannes Hoftorp could choose for the game, how the visitors will set up and how the game is likely to pan out as a result. And then we're going to come on to Emiliano Marcondes, because it looks like he's going to be staying at the club next season. It's likely that City activate that 12-month option they've got to keep him at Carrow Road. So I'm going to look at what he offers to the team tactically and why that is probably a good thing going forward. But we're going to begin with that predicted 11. So without further ado, here's the team I think Torrop will pick for tomorrow's game. So I've gone for Angus Gunn in goal, Kellen Fisher at right back, Shane Duffy and Jose Cordoba in the centre of defence, with Kenny McLean at left back, Jacob Wright, Emiliano Marcondes and Marcelino Nunez in the centre of midfield, with Ante Sienat on the right, Borja Sainz on the left and Josh Sargent through the middle up front. A couple of changes in there, but primary amongst them maybe is the fact that I've gone for Torrop to return to a back four, and I think that only makes sense when you consider the opposition, the fact that Norwich are back at home, and of course, Portsmouth won't be easy to beat whatsoever. They're in a relegation battle. They're looking quite good in it, to be honest, but they do still have a lot to play for. They showed Norwich earlier on in the season as well that it's not easy to get past them in that 0-0 draw. But I think at home with 4 games left, not loads to play for, and against a team that's towards the bottom end of the Championship, I think there is pressure on Norwich to go out and attack and to revert to the sort of system that I think we've seen produce wonders at times this season. Of course, that hasn't been consistent enough, not really anywhere near it. But I think they will try to produce one of those performances rather than the more defensive setup that they used against Burnley, against West Brom, against actually Portsmouth, as I mentioned earlier on in the season. In that 0-0 draw, I think it has to be a back four in that 4-3-3, but I've gone for Kenny McLean at left back. That feels like it might be a fixture for the rest of the campaign, with Ben Krasene and Lucian Mahovo both out. I think Callum Doyle was in training videos going into it. Of course, I'll ask Torrop at his press conference later today about that, and Sienats is in a similar bracket as to whether they might be fit or not. But after Doyle's been out for a little while, and given the fact that actually McLean has been quite a good presence in that left back role, I think that's the back four that Torrop will probably choose. There's another discussion to be had about whether whether there's really any point in him playing in any of these last 4 games, because although I know he's very well appreciated by the Norwich fans and he's actually had quite a decent season on a personal level, Torrop has said that it's very unlikely that they sign him permanently. I don't think the finances will really work for them from that perspective. So when you're looking at the long term, and much of the focus now is going into next season, it doesn't really make loads of sense for Doyle to be in there. So we'll see what happens there, but I think that's the back four Torrop will go with. Then in the midfield, I've gone for Marcondes ahead of Slimane in there. I think after a week's rest, it feels pretty likely that Marcelino Nunez is back in the starting 11 after originally starting on the bench against Burnley. Obviously, Jacob Wright has been very, very good in the last few weeks. We spoke about him on the last episode of Tactics Board, if you'd like to go back and watch that. But certainly you can't criticise his performances in the last few weeks, so it feels likely that he's in there. So then it really does come down to a choice between, the rest, basically Marcondes, Slimane, Forsen, Jakob Sorensen. And I think although Sorensen actually has had quite a lot of game time recently and Forsen does seem to be on the comeback trail, we haven't seen too much of the latter. And if you want a more attacking setup, it does have to probably come down to a choice between Slimane and Marcondes. But Slimane's had a lot of game time recently. As I mentioned earlier, Marcondes looks likely to be at the club next season. So in terms of the long term, it works to have him there as well. And I just think against a team that may well sit back and be a little bit deeper and say to Norwich, okay, come and open us up, then Marcondes is probably more likely to do that at the moment than Slimane. I think there have been a couple of fairly decent performances from Slimane over the last few weeks. Of course, had a very difficult role in the first half against Burnley as a left winger, which I don't think we're likely to probably see again based on that performance, but I think Marcondes is still just a little bit ahead of him in those creative stakes at the moment. So I think it could well be him in there. As I mentioned, Seaman has obviously been out for the last couple of games, but the word has been that it's not been a particularly serious injury, that he's unlikely to be out for too long. So obviously we'll have confirmation from Torup about that in the press conference, but I think when you look at some of the other options that he has to choose from, of course, it looks unlikely that Matej Jurasek is going to be available for this one as well. Seaman is the only person really that he can have in there, and I think the rest of the team speaks for itself. So definitely some room for change in that 11 after quite a drastic change in the setup against Burnley, but it will be interesting to see what Torup does with that team when the news drops at 2 p.m. tomorrow. On to Portsmouth, and I think there are almost three camps that you can divide Championship teams into this season tactically. Obviously, they're quite broad camps when you consider the tiny nuances that teams work on at the moment. But I think there's the sort of possession-based one that obviously Norwich would fit into, the more direct and physical one that, you know, you might have a sort of a Preston, someone like that in there. And then there are the adaptable types. I would put Coventry in there, particularly before Frank Lampard was appointed. I think Sunderland go in there as well, and probably Portsmouth based on their performances this season. Now, they can clearly do it quite well, having come up from League One, not spent loads of money, and still looking pretty good in terms of their prospects of staying in the Championship. But that is a bit of a problem for Norwich in terms of tactically how they set up, because obviously they will be watching games that they play, and there will be fairly familiar patterns. There's danger out wide from Portsmouth pretty regularly, a lot of it from Norwich Academy graduate Josh Murphy, who's been excellent for them this season. But they do tend to adapt based on the opposition. If the opposition is vulnerable to possession-based teams who play the ball through the lines, then Portsmouth will try to do that. If they're quite good in possession themselves, and Portsmouth need to defend their own space quite well and be compact and work as a unit, then they can do that very well as well. And actually, that was what they did at Fratton Park earlier in the season. They had started to develop a little bit of form, but they weren't quite looking as good in the table as they are now. So they went pretty solid. Norwich did the same, having struggled themselves with injuries. They stuck Ashley Barnes up front. It was him versus Marlon Pack in quite the physical battle in that game. And I think Portsmouth may try to do something fairly similar this time round. Now, the problem for them will be that Norwich will probably look very different. So if they want to analyse how they got a point against them earlier on in the season and try to use a similar system, then it won't quite work in exactly the same way. But we have actually seen at times that Norwich do struggle when teams sit deep. The ideal scenario for them in terms of opposition is one that plays quite a high line but doesn't really press them particularly well. I think that was the problem for Coventry earlier on in the season, for a couple of teams really, who have sort of gone to Carrow Road and struggled. I think against Stoke, that was a real problem because they didn't quite have the energy to press high, but they tried quite a high back line. So either for Norwich, you want somebody, you know, in terms of how you want to play against Norwich, you either want to be pressing high, backed up by a high defensive line, or you want to be sat deep with not much engagement up until sort of the halfway line, and then giving Norwich the space and time to sort of break you down. And I think with probably the lack of confidence that there is in the Norwich camp at the moment with some of their recent results, that will be quite a tough task if Portsmouth can do that. So Norwich will need to be strong defensively in wide areas. They'll need to probably work on the interconnectivity between the team, because Portsmouth do work really, really well as a unit to stop those balls going in between them and through their lines. And they will need to be aware of the fact that Portsmouth can change their tactical system in different ways. So not a particularly predictable game when it comes to tactics, but I think probably that the onus will be on Norwich to try to make something happen. Somebody who will be key in that mission if he plays is Emiliano Marcondes, the more creative type of midfielder that Norwich have had this season. I still don't feel like they have a proper true number 10, at least not somebody playing in that position. I think Oscar Schwartau possibly could be that man in the future, but he's played mostly out wide this season, so it does feel like they're lacking that true creative flair player in that attacking midfield position. But I think Marcondes is the closest to what they've got there. He takes up really intelligent positions. He links up really well with Josh Sargent, and I think their connectivity is something that you've really been able to see at various times this season. I think when Sargent came on against Burnley in the last game, you could really tell that they were two players who worked really well. I thought Marcondes came alive actually at that point when they were able to come together. And I think in that sort of inside right position, he can do really, really well. Now, obviously against Burnley, that was notionally as a winger where he was tucking in, but I think it could be similar in a game where Norwich will be attacking quite a lot of it. You'd expect that the winger will be quite wide, so Marcondes will actually be in a similar position. And when he does get himself into those sort of number 10 positions in and around the D, he does have that quality and that clarity of thought to find nice through balls through, to shoot at the right times. And although I think his quality maybe from shooting positions at times this season could have been better, there aren't many players in that Norwich team who manage to pick up that space in between the lines as well. And when you combine that with his competitiveness that I think we've all seen, the physical profile that he has that maybe not many players in that position have as well, I think it is a recipe for success, and it has been for most of the season at Norwich. There has still been an element of inconsistency, I think, and although he has certainly been more consistent than some of his fellow arrivals this season, he hasn't quite hit the heights as often as you would have liked. I think there have been times when Norwich fans have been watching him going, how on earth was he a free signing in October who didn't have a club? And I do think within that context, he has been an absolutely excellent signing, a good pickup for Norwich when actually they had to spend a lot of money to get the sorts of players they wanted in the summer and in the winter transfer window as well. Getting him on a free to add to that sort of experienced core of players is quite helpful as well. So I think when you take the tactics into consideration, the fact that Norwich don't really have too many players who can take up those sorts of positions, it could be really helpful if they do extend that contract, which it looks like they probably will. And also in the dressing room and in terms of that experience that they have, that not necessarily desire to win, because I'm well aware that obviously young players want to win as much as possible as well. But I think he will do whatever it takes, and he has maybe a little bit more knowledge of what it does take than those young players who haven't had as many appearances, as much experience. Of course, he's been promoted on multiple occasions to the Premier League. So I think he brings something that Norwich don't quite have. And although you would like to see his consistency up, and that might be a struggle at his age, but although you would like to see that consistency improve, otherwise not really much of a tough decision for Ben Napper to take when it came to that contract and that 12-month option. So there's probably one of the several problems that Norwich face, or the decisions that they face going into next season, sorted. We'll see what the summer holds. I expect it will be a busy one, but of course 4 games to get through before then, and that kicks off with Portsmouth, and we'll have every kick of the game covered. So go to pinken.com/subscribe if you haven't already, and you'll have access to all of our analysis, coverage, and maybe even if you're not too excited about the last few games of the season, remember it will be a very active summer, and of course we'll have every bit of that covered as well. Thank you very much for joining me on Tactics Board. I'll be back again soon, and hopefully the atmosphere, the feeling is positive after a victory over Portsmouth. Let's see. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you very soon. Bye-bye.